Russia continues to terrorize Ukrainian cities, trying to make up for its failure on the front line and break not just the army's spirit, but that of the entire nation. Meanwhile, Kyiv is working hard to secure more weapons, develop its own air defense systems, and rely increasingly on itself. Joining me now in the studio is retired general, writer, and friend of Ukraine, Mick Ryan. General Ryan, it's always a pleasure to have you here in our studio. There are some disturbing news spreading through media that in November Russia may be capable of launching up to 2,000 drones per day. Does that number shock you? Because even now, when Russia launches just around 500 drones at a time, it was few times, it was horrific. Ukraine's air defense are struggling to cope.
Yeah, I think that it is a shocking number, but as we've seen throughout this war, Ukrainian armed forces have been up to the challenge of adapting to these kind of threats. The Shaheds, are designed to overwhelm the air defence system and force the defenders to launch off interceptors that Ukraine can sorely afford to replace. There are some very good drone interceptor programs, however, American and Ukrainian initiatives, including Dronefall from Come Back Alive. One hopes that Ukraine can scale up these cheap interceptors at about $5,000 each, and that they will be up to the challenge of these very large-scale potential raids that the Russians might conduct in November.
Do you think that the more Russia won't succeed on the battlefield, the more they will attack Ukrainian cities just to show, that they can hold Ukrainians in fear and under pressure, even with no serious success on the battlefield? Or am I wrong?
No, I think part of the Russian strategy is inflicting massive trauma and terror on Ukrainian civilians. I mean, this is not an accident. It is not a byproduct. It is a deliberate design feature of Russia's strategy to subjugate the people, the government, the nation of Ukraine. So I think this is part of the reason why the US president has issued this 50-day ultimatum, because he's finally, figured out that maybe Vladimir Putin is lying to him, leading him up the garden path. And, hopefully America might shift its policy on support to Ukraine at the end of that 50 days. We'd all like to see it before then, of course. What's happened is got another 50 days to kill Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, but perhaps we might see a shift in US policy.
But in such a scenario, should Ukraine consider increasing its own strikes on Russian territory? Remember that Donald Trump was asking Ukrainian president about that.
Well, it's hard to see how Russia will stop without Ukraine doing long-range strikes on Russian oil facilities, airfields, munitions depots, factories. I think Ukraine will inevitably have to step up its long-range strikes with larger numbers of long-range drones. Now, Ukraine has, in 3 years, developed an amazing long-range strike capability that, most countries in the world just don't possess. And it is continuously adding different long-range strike weapons to its arsenal. That will have to be part of convincing Putin that he just can't win this war, that the Ukrainian people will not be defeated.
And NATO's new Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, General Alexis Grinkevich, has openly warned about a potential dual theater conflict with both Russia and China. Do you believe Western military planning is adapting quickly enough to that reality? Because I see the Western headlines that NATO has a year and a half to be prepared for, Russia to attack them. Do you think they are ready enough?
No, we're not ready enough. We're certainly talking a lot and thinking a lot, but we're just not doing enough to prepare for this threat. Western militaries need to be able to support Ukraine, deal with the other threats that Russia poses across Europe, as well as deal with the threats that China poses in Asia and that Russia poses, because they have a Pacific fleet as well. It makes sense that if China was to do something against Taiwan or against the Senkakus that are owned by Japan, that Russia would do something in Europe to distract Europe and the United States. So I think those comments made a lot of sense by the new NATO commander, that China and Russia may not be friends, but they have common interests at the moment, and that common interest includes seeing this war go on to distract America in lots of different parts of the world.
Yeah, I will go back to China in a second. You know, it's not a secret that I'm quite a fan of your podcast, of listening to your interviews with other people. And in your recent conversation with Aaron Baumhoff, or maybe I'm mistaken, maybe I'm not spelling it correctly, I'm sorry for that. But you mentioned that Europe is finally recognizing the seriousness of the Russian threat. From the Ukrainian perspective, you know, General Ryan, it's a strange statement, as bombs have been falling here for our heads for years. Why has it taken so long for some European nations to treat Moscow as the threat, which is clearly is?
Well, I think part of it is that they've seen that Russia does not want to give up in Ukraine. That's part of the shift in thinking in Europe, but also the very wide-scale subversion, misinformation and sabotage campaign that is being conducted by the Russians across Europe, including sabotage of warehouses, attempted murders of CEOs of defence companies, sabotage of internet lines. You know, I think Europeans are finally waking up that, yes, the Russians are a very significant threat. That's a good thing, but we're yet to see the rapid action to build up the size of the militaries, build up defence industrial production that's needed to deter further military aggression from the Russians.
Yes, and they're spending a lot of money to military developments and everything, much more than Europe do in total, actually.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians are spending a lot, but Europe is a much, much wealthier entity than Russia is. If they decided to spend more, they could easily outspend Russia and have a much bigger military. They just have to decide to do it.
Yeah, it's like endless circus. You said about the Russia and China. What is China's true strategic interest in Russia's war against Ukraine? Is Beijing frustrated by the lack of clear success from Moscow here in Ukraine?
Well, I think at one level it probably is. You know, it is looking at a military that's not dissimilar to its own, that hasn't been very successful. I mean, if we had a look at the American invasion of Iraq after 3 years, and the Americans only owned 12% of Iraq and lost 1 million casualties, we wouldn't say they were winning. And it's the same with Russia. So I think the Chinese are frustrated with that. But at the same time, it is in the Chinese interest for this war to continue, because it keeps the Europeans in Europe, not out in the Pacific. It keeps at least a portion of the US military focused in Europe. And whilst that's happening, the Chinese can do what they're doing in the Pacific to coerce, to threaten, and to engage in other forms of military aggression against many countries in our region, including my own.
Oh, well, that's quite disturbing. But in that case, how far is China willing to go in supporting Russia? Where might Beijing draw the line?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think the line is at the direct contribution of military forces. It clearly has not done that. North Korea has. But I think the Chinese are providing a range of dual-use goods, particularly the vast majority of electronics that go into the Shahed drones that are fired in large numbers at Ukraine every single night. And Chinese engineers and technicians have helped the Russians improve the number and quality of those drones at Russian factories the Chinese have helped build. So, you know, the Chinese are buying cheap Russian oil. That's helping China and Russia. China is amplifying Russian misinformation. That's helping them in the UN. So it's offering a huge amount of assistance, and they are Russia's biggest supporter in this war, unfortunately.
You know, as Chinese people say, I don't know how it's in Chinese, but they say that they don't have any enemies, only divergent interests. So when you look on their relation between China and Russia, you understand that very
Well,
clear.
they're certainly acting like Ukraine is its enemy because they're giving a lot of support, physical and moral, to the Russians' brutal campaign against the Ukrainian people.
Okay, thank you for clarification. And some Ukrainian officials are saying, privately, that relations between Kyiv and Washington are warming again. And do you see concrete signs of that improvement?
Yeah, I think certainly the low point was, the very distressing meeting that we all watched 28 February of President Zelensky in the Oval Office. It was terrible to see him treated that way. But I think we've seen a slow increase in the ties between the Trump administration and the Zelensky government. That has been aided by many politicians in Europe. The Germans, the French, the British have helped that relationship strengthen again. I also think the changes in the Ukrainian government with the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, new Defence Minister in particular, that were announced last week, that should help further strengthen the relationship between the Trump administration and the Zelensky government. Now, whether it ever returns to the warmth and the generosity of the US government we saw under the Biden administration remains to be seen, and I think we should express some skepticism about that.
Yeah, but General Ryan, they all are the same people. The changes in Ukrainian government, they all are the same.
Yes, I mean, they are the same people, but they're dealing with different interlocutors in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, it is the same group of people, and there has been some criticism that there weren't the number of fresh faces that might have been useful in this government.
Yeah. I don't want to underestimate and to be disrespectful to what they do to Ukraine, definitely. There are a lot of questions why so. And I will always think and ask a lot of experts, it's still a misery to me why Trump giving Putin chance by chance. I don't know what I was reading about the controversy theories about behind that, but what is your view?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that scholars for the next few centuries will probably ponder. I think it's a combination of things. I think he has an attraction to strong authoritarian leadership styles, whether it's national or government leaders. I think that, his political base, those who elect him, have a strong isolationist bent, and that kind of, supports what Putin's trying to do in Europe and what Xi's trying to do in the Pacific. And I think also that he's a very transactional person. This isn't someone who has strong values-based ideas or an ideological approach to how the world works. It's based on one deal after another. That doesn't lend itself to great strategy. It lends itself to opportunistic decision-making, which may not work out well in the long term for America, Ukraine, or its friends.